The psychic powers, once hailed by some as the kindred's glorious evolution, rapidly deteriorated into an undeniable, horrifying burden. The fleeting moments of clarity and tactical brilliance were now overshadowed by an incessant, agonizing mental static, a chorus of unheard voices and unseen horrors that gnawed at the edges of Kroot sanity. The Valar's gift, like a potent but unstable poison, was slowly consuming the ghost eaters from within. The younger Kroot, their minds less structured, less resilient than their elders, were the first to succumb fully to the madness. Gnarl Quill, once a promising hunter, was now a hollowed-out shell, his eyes unfocused, his body racked by tremors. He would babble incoherently of shadow eaters and whispering worms that burrowed into his skull, driving him to claw at his own flesh. His once potent psychic senses had become a conduit for pure, unadulterated terror. He could no longer distinguish between the physical reality of Xylos Prime and the terrifying, ephemeral landscape of the warp. He would recoil from the touch of his own kin, seeing them as grotesque, dim Similar incidents multiplied across the kindred. Other young hunters, who had eagerly embraced the initial surge of power, now exhibited signs of profound mental degradation. Some became utterly catatonic, staring blankly into space, their minds adrift in the immaterium. Others developed extreme paranoia, believing their own comrades to be agents of the whispering entities, leading to violent, fratricidal outbursts that claimed lives and sowed deep mistrust. A few, in a terrifying display of uncontrolled power, experienced spontaneous psychic detonations, their minds overloading and erupting in a silent, internal scream that left only a scorched, smoking crater where a Kroot had once stood. The physical toll was equally devastating. The constant strain on their nervous systems led to rapid physiological decay. Their usually vibrant quills became brittle and dull, their skin pallid, their bodies emaciated as the psychic drain superseded their nutritional needs. Even their formidable Kroot regeneration, usually capable of knitting bone and muscle back together with alarming speed, seemed to slow, their wounds festering with unnatural speed, as if the warp itself resisted the healing of their bodies. The schism within the kindred widened into an unbridgeable chasm. The gifted, those still struggling to control their powers and convinced of their ultimate utility, clung desperately to the hope that they could master the Valar essence. They believed that the suffering was a necessary rite of passage, a trial by fire that would forge them into something greater. They often congregated near the Valar cavern, convinced that further consumption, or perhaps a different method of ingestion, would unlock the true potential and provide the key to stability. They sought communion with the lingering psychic echoes of the Valar, hoping for guidance that never came, only further confusion. Opposing them were the cursed, primarily the older, more traditional Kroot, who had resisted the initial consumption, or had taken only minimal amounts. These elders, witnessing the tragic decline of their younger kin, saw the Valar essence as a poison, an insidious corruption that had infected the very soul of the kindred. They advocated for total abstinence, for ancient purification rituals, though these proved utterly ineffective against the warp's insidious touch, and for a return to the old ways, a complete rejection of all psychic phenomena. They saw the burgeoning powers as a direct affront to Kroot ancestral spirits, a violation of the natural order, and the cause of the demonic incursions that now plagued Xylos Prime. They viewed the gifted with a mixture of pity and fear, often ostracizing them, seeing them as already lost. Shaper Kalar, his own mind a tempest of conflicting thoughts and agonizing visions, was caught in the middle. He had seen the initial promise, the tactical advantage, the evolutionary leap. But he had also felt the cold, insidious touch of the warp, witnessed the descent into madness, and heard the screams of his kindred, both psychic and physical. He bore the weight of his initial decision, the terrible responsibility for the doom he had inadvertently brought upon his people. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, now held a haunted, far-away look, shadowed by the constant pressure of unseen forces. His quills, once a healthy green, now flickered with unstable, unnatural colors, shifting between dull amber and sickly purple, mirroring the turmoil within his soul. He tried to bridge the gap, to mediate the growing animosity between the two factions, but his words often fell on deaf ears. The gifted saw him as hesitant, unwilling to fully embrace their shared evolution. The cursed saw him as tainted, the architect of their kindred's downfall. His authority, once absolute, began to fray at the edges, undermined by the internal strife and the terrifying, incomprehensible nature of their new enemy. The Kroot, a species defined by their adaptability and their collective strength, were now tearing themselves apart. The constant internal conflict, coupled with the drain of their unstable powers and the escalating demonic incursions, left them vulnerable. Their once formidable tactical prowess waned, replaced by disorganization and paranoia. Their once silent and deadly movements were now often betrayed by random psychic flares or the agonized cries of a Kroot succumbing to madness. Xylos Prime, once their sanctuary, was becoming their prison. The invisible enemy, drawn by their uncontrolled psychic emissions, was closing in. And Kalar, the Shaper, who had sought to lead his kindred to a new evolutionary height, now watched in despair as they teetered on the brink of self-destruction, consumed by the very power they had so eagerly sought. The gift had become a noose, tightening slowly around the neck of the Ghost Eater's kindred, dragging them inexorably towards a precipice of madness and oblivion. The war for Xylos Prime, unseen and unheard by the greater galaxy, had raged internally within the Ghost Eater's kindred and externally against the encroaching demonic entities. But now, another, more conventional threat materialized from the cold vacuum of space. A crude, brutal wag of orcs, their ramshackle fleet drawn to the planet by the very psychic anomalies that plagued the Kroot, or, in their primal way, perceived the psychic emanations not as a terrifying warp signature, but as the tantalizing scent of a really good fight, a glorious, chaotic battlefield waiting to be carved up, a flotilla of orc vessels, a haphazard collection of rusty hulks, asteroid chunks strapped with engines, and barely space-worthy craft descended upon Xylos Prime's atmosphere. Their thunderous arrival, marked by crude orbital bombardments and the clamor of countless green-skinned warriors eager for slaughter, was a deafening counterpoint to the subtle horrors the Ghost Eaters had been facing. For the Kroot, already stretched to breaking point by internal strife and demonic incursions, the arrival of the orcs was the final, devastating straw. The orcs, led by a particularly brutish war boss named Grugruk Edbasha, immediately established crude landing zones, disgorging hordes of boys, knobs, and trucks into the dense jungle. Their objective was simple: fight everything, loot anything, and have the biggest, most glorious wow possible. They cared nothing for the subtle psychic energies or the lurking demons. They simply saw enemies to be crumped and territories to be taken. Against any other Kroot kindred, the orcs would have faced a cunning, evasive foe capable of bleeding them dry through guerrilla tactics. But the Ghost Eaters were not themselves. The internal schism had paralyzed their coordination. The cursed Kroot, those resisting the psychic influence, fought with desperate ferocity, but lacked the prescient edge that had once made their kindred formidable. The gifted Kroot, their minds still fractured by warp influence, found their psychic abilities wildly unstable under the sheer, brutal mental noise of the approaching orc wow, the guttural roars, the thudding footsteps, The primal bloodlust of thousands of orcs crashed into their vulnerable minds like a physical wave, causing disorientation and agony. Their foresight flickered. Their empathy became a torment of overwhelming green-skinned aggression, and their attempts at subtle mental manipulation were drowned out by the orcs' collective, joyous thirst for violence. Yet, in their desperation, an almost suicidal cohesion formed, faced with an external enemy that threatened total annihilation. The Ghost Eaters rediscovered a semblance of unity. Kalar, now visibly aged and strained, ordered a desperate last-stand defense around the Valar cavern, recognizing it as the nexus of their power, and perhaps their doom. It was here, amidst the pulsating, crystalline roots, that the Ghost Eaters would make their final, desperate stand. The battle that ensued was an orgy of violence, a maelstrom of green skin, black quills, and flickering demonic forms. Orcs, utterly oblivious to the subtle psychic influences, charged headlong into the fray, their choppas and shootas tearing through the jungle. But as they closed, the psychic resonance of the Ghost Eaters, amplified by their collective desperation and the proximity of the Valar, flared with an intensity unlike anything before. Gnarl Quill, his mind shattered, but his survival instinct raw, let out a scream that was not of this world. A wave of raw, uncontrolled psychic energy erupted from him, a silent, concussive force that threw back a wave of charging Gretchen, leaving them stunned and bleeding from their ears. Other gifted Kroot, pushed to the brink, manifested similar bursts. Projectiles from orc shootas would suddenly veer off course. Trucks would inexplicably stall, their engines dying. The orcs, confused but never deterred, simply attributed it to weird boy magic, or dem things being too tricky. But the price was immense. Every psychic burst, every uncontrolled manifestation of power, further tore at the fabric of reality. The metallic scent of ozone and blood intensified. The air shimmered, and then, in multiple locations, the veil tore. Demons, drawn by the raw psychic energy and the immense bloodshed, began to pour through. Bloodletters manifested amongst the orc lines, gleefully hacking apart both Kroot and greenskins. Horrors of Zinter flickered into existence, laughing maniacally as they spewed warp fire, igniting the already volatile jungle. Nurglings swarmed the fallen, rapidly decaying bodies, spreading their joyous contagion. The battle became a three-way war of utter, mind-numbing chaos. Orcs fought Kroot, Kroot fought orcs, and demons fought everyone, reveling in the carnage. Kalar, seeing the encroaching demon hordes, realized that the psychic gift that had briefly granted them dominance was now irrevocably attracting the very ruin of their kindred. He knew they had to win, but the cost was now clearly laid bare. He saw Stalker Maw, his usually calm demeanor replaced by an almost frenzied determination, tear through a dozen orc boys, his every strike imbued with a faint, shimmering psychic boost that made his blows unnaturally fast and powerful. But even as he fought, Stalker Maw's face contorted in agony, his empathy now a searing brand as he felt the crude, joyful demise of every orc he slew, and the growing hunger of the demons. The Ghost Eaters fought with a ferocity born of desperation and the sheer will to survive. They pushed back the orcs, their combined, if unstable, psychic might finally proving too much for the green tide's crude resilience. They channeled their prescience to dodge overwhelming charges, used their nascent telepathy to coordinate impossible flanking maneuvers, and unleashed bursts of raw psychic energy that disintegrated weaker orcs or sent them stumbling in disarray. Warboss, Grugruk, Edbasha himself fell, his massive head split open by a combination of concentrated rifle fire and a searing, unseen psychic bolt from Kalar himself, leaving his Wog leaderless and disoriented. The orcs eventually broke, their Wog shattered, their lust for battle sated by the sheer, overwhelming chaos. They retreated in disarray, leaving Xylos Prime, a ravaged, burning wasteland littered with their dead. But the victory was hollow. The kindred was decimated. A third of the Ghost Eaters lay dead, their bodies torn apart by orc choppas or immolated by warp fire. Another third were irrevocably lost to madness, their minds consumed by the warp, their bodies twitching husks. The psychic backlash from the battle was catastrophic. The entire area around the Valar cavern now pulsed with unstable warp energy. The veil between realities was not merely thin. It was torn wide, shimmering with iridescent light, through which the unholy forms of the demons could be seen. Not just fleetingly, but with terrifying clarity. They were no longer incursions. They were settling. Kalar stood amidst the wreckage, his body trembling, his mind screaming with the echoes of battle and the hungry whispers from beyond. He had won the battle against the orcs, but at an unspeakable cost. The Ghost Eaters had paid a terrible price for their power, for their evolution. They had repelled one enemy, only to invite a far more insidious and eternal foe. The Valar essence, the source of their strength, was now clearly a conduit to damnation. The victory was a Pyrrhic one, soaked in blood and madness, echoing with the triumphant snarls of newly emboldened demons. And in the distance, a new hum, colder and more methodical than the orc wah, began to vibrate through the stars. The approach of the Imperium. In the harrowing aftermath of the orc wag, amidst the smoldering ruins of their encampments and the chilling silence broken only by the whispers of the warp, Shaper Kalar and the surviving elders of the Ghost Eater's kindred faced a brutal truth. The Valar essence, the source of their newfound power, was undeniably linked to their descent into madness and the escalating demonic incursions. Their very survival hinged on understanding this insidious connection, on dissecting the nature of the gift that had become their curse. Driven by desperation and a rekindled, albeit desperate, Kroot curiosity, Kalar led a small, grim expedition back to the Valar cavern. It was a pilgrimage born of necessity, fraught with peril. The cavern, once a place of silent, pulsating calm, now thrummed with a far more aggressive, unsettling energy. The iridescent moisture on its walls shimmered with unnatural colors, and the very air vibrated with discordant psychic noise, a cacophony that grated on even the cursed Kroot, who had largely resisted the Valar's influence. The Valar network itself had changed. The crystalline roots, once radiating a gentle, placid light, now pulsed erratically, their colors shifting between brilliant, almost blinding hues and dull, sickly tones. Where they had once conveyed peace, they now emanated a palpable sense of anxiety, a raw, primal alarm that reverberated directly into the Kroot's exposed minds. Kalar, drawing upon generations of assimilated knowledge and the desperate gamble of his own burdened mind, ordered a selective, ritualistic consumption of the Valar. This was not for power, but for understanding. He chose only those Kroot who had demonstrated a degree of mental resilience, Kroot who, despite their exposure, had not entirely succumbed to the madness. He himself partook a larger portion this time, steeling his will against the inevitable psychic deluge. The experience was horrific. The initial consumption had been disorienting. This was an agonizing unraveling. The Valar essence, amplified by the pervasive warp influence on Xylos Prime, flooded their minds with a deluge of raw, unfiltered information. It was like drinking from an oceanic current with a thimble, an overwhelming torrent that threatened to drown their consciousness. But amidst the chaos, fragments of coherence began to emerge. The Valar, it became clear, were not merely a psychic species. They were a collective consciousness, an ancient xenobotanical life form that had, over eons, evolved a profound connection to the immaterium. They were like living anchors, their crystalline roots acting as natural conduits, passively drawing and filtering psychic energy from the warp, converting it into a stable, internal resonance that fueled their slow, plant-like growth and their vast, interconnected consciousness. They had existed in peaceful symbiosis with the immaterium for countless millennia. Their remote location and unique biology shielding them from its predatory inhabitants. Their placid, filtered psychic emanations were too subtle, too benign to attract the demons. They were a natural, living psychic battery, a filter for the raw energy of the warp, converting chaos into calm. The Kroot consumption had shattered this delicate balance. By ingesting the Velar essence, the Ghost Eaters had not simply acquired psychic abilities. They had absorbed the Velar's unique biological connection to the warp. But without the ions of evolutionary adaptation that allowed the Velar to filter and contain that energy, the Kroot, with their predatory, adaptive metabolism, had rapidly metabolized the Velar's psychic conduits, grafting them onto their own physiology. This created an unprecedented, terrifying effect. The Ghost Eaters became not filters, but magnifiers and beacons. Their rapidly evolving Kroot physiology, designed to assimilate and express genetic traits, took the Velar's passive psychic connection and transformed it into an active, aggressive one. Their nascent psychic abilities, the foresight, the empathy, the telekinetic bursts, these were not merely talents. They were raw, unfiltered expressions of warp energy, leaking directly from their minds. The Kroot's own metabolism, meant to adapt, was now adapting to the warp itself, integrating the ability to draw upon it directly. But without the Velar's ancient, innate inhibitors, their connection was wild, uncontrolled, and terribly seductive to the denizens of the immaterium. The kindred was unwittingly ripping small holes in reality with every thought, every emotion, every act of psychic will. They were not merely attracting demons, they were inviting them, creating the very fissures through which they could pour into the material realm. Moreover, the elders, delving deeper into the Velar's ancient, dormant memories, uncovered chilling echoes. The Velar had been aware, on a deep, instinctual level, of the dangers of the raw immaterium. They had instinctively evolved their passive, filtering nature as a defense mechanism, their vast network a psychic shield against the chaos. The faint sense of alarm Kalar now perceived from them was not simply fear of the Kroot. It was a profound, cosmic dread, the slow, agonizing death throes of a species whose eons-long balance was being irrevocably shattered by the Kroot's predatory assimilation. The Valar's very existence was being corrupted, their peaceful nature twisted by the Kroot's aggressive consumption, morphing them into uncontrolled conduits for the warp. The horrifying truth settled upon Kalar. The Valar essence was not simply a pathway to power, but a biological key that unlocked a dormant, warp-sensitive aspect within the Kroot genome itself, an ancient echo of their own species' evolutionary journey that had long since been suppressed or forgotten. The Valar had merely reactivated it, but in a chaotic, uncontrolled fashion. The Kroot had not just consumed a psychic species. They had unwittingly triggered a latent genetic predisposition for raw, unshielded psychic power, making them profoundly vulnerable to the predation of the warp. The knowledge brought no comfort, only despair. The solution was not in more consumption, not in further understanding of the Valar. The solution, if one existed, lay in severing this terrible connection, in purging the warp taint from their very being. But how does one purge an evolution, a genetic mutation that had now been assimilated into the very blood of the kindred? Kalar looked at the shimmering, unstable crystalline roots of the Valar, no longer seeing a source of power, but a dying species, unwillingly dragged into the same damnation as his own kindred. The gift was a curse, and the knowledge of its true nature was the cruelest torment of all. The terrible truth of their affliction, unearthed from the dying echoes of the Valar, plunged Kalar into a profound crisis. The kindred was a dying flame, flickering against the rising tide of madness and demonic predation. He saw the haunted eyes of his warriors, heard the incoherent babbling of the most afflicted, and felt the ceaseless, hungry whispers of the warp clawing at his own mind. The pride of the Ghost Eaters, their mastery of Xylos Prime, had withered into a desperate struggle for mere survival. He had to act, not for power, but for salvation. His first attempt was a desperate, almost heretical return to ancient Kroot traditions. The Kroot, through millennia of consuming diverse life, had developed intricate dietary restrictions and ritualistic purifications. Certain rare fungi, specific types of mineral-rich soil, and the flesh of particular beasts were believed to cleanse the body and mind, re-establishing balance after a particularly potent or dangerous consumption. Kalar, with the help of the few remaining mentally stable elders, initiated these rituals. He gathered the remaining kindred, those not too far gone into madness, and led them through a gauntlet of ancestral rites. They consumed bitter, fibrous plants known to purge toxins. They smeared themselves with a particular black clay, believed to absorb negative energies, chanting ancient, guttural songs to their ancestors. They ingested the raw hearts of the fiercest predators of Xylos Prime, hoping to rekindle the pure, untainted ferocity that had once defined them, hoping to drown out the insidious whispers with primal instinct. For a time, there seemed to be a fragile glimmer of hope. The most potent purges seemed to offer temporary respite. The incessant hum behind the eyes would dull for a few hours. The fleeting glimpses of demonic horrors would recede to the periphery. Gnarl Quill, during one such ritual, experienced a moment of terrifying clarity, screaming a coherent warning about the great raven's eye before relapsing into his incoherent babbling. Stalker Maw, for a brief period, was able to hunt without the overwhelming burden of his empathy. His senses sharpened once more for the kill. But the relief was fleeting, a cruel mirage in a desert of despair. The warp taint was not merely a physical toxin. It was a deeply ingrained spiritual and genetic corruption, an evolutionary leap that could not be simply purged by ancient dietary laws. The moment the effects of the purification rituals wore off, the psychic onslaught returned with renewed ferocity, often stronger than before. The demons, as if annoyed by the Kroot's attempts to throw off their influence, seemed to respond with increased malevolence. The whispers grew louder, the shadows deeper, and the incursions more frequent. The ritualistic consumption of purifying elements often resulted in agonizing psychic backlash, as if the warp itself recoiled from the attempt to cleanse its influence, retaliating with intensified mental assault. Kalar observed these failures with a growing sense of futility. He saw his kindred perform the rituals with dwindling faith, their movements slow and desperate. The traditional purifications, potent against biological toxins, were utterly powerless against the raw, unthinking chaos of the immaterium. It was like trying to put out a sun with a bucket of water. He then turned to more desperate measures. He began to experiment with the Velar itself. If consumption was the problem, perhaps a controlled, partial reversal was the solution. He tasked the most resilient Kroot to attempt to digest or expel the Velar essence, perhaps by consuming specific parasites or enzymes that could target the specific warp-sensitive components. He even considered a complete cessation of all consumption, a radical starvation ritual, hoping to starve the warp taint from their very bodies. These attempts were met with catastrophic results. Some Kroot withered and died, their psychic pathways collapsing in on themselves, leaving their bodies as empty husks. Others experienced terrifying, uncontrolled psychic explosions, their minds disintegrating under the strain of trying to reject the ingrained essence. The warp, once assimilated, seemed to resist all attempts at expulsion with brutal force, punishing any Kroot who dared defy its encroaching influence. Kalar himself suffered deeply. His meditations, once a source of strength, now became battlegrounds. He wrestled with his own burgeoning psychic abilities, trying to bind them, to silence them, to sever the invisible tendrils that connected his mind to the warp. He tried to erect mental barriers, to wall off the incessant noise, but the warp was a sea, and his mind was merely a leaky vessel. He felt the vast, observing hungers, the malicious intellects pressing against his consciousness, like sharks circling a wounded prey. He knew with absolute certainty that even if the kindred somehow survived, he himself was doomed, his mind irreparably scarred, a permanent conduit to the horrors of the immaterium. His last, most desperate measure was to try and understand the demons themselves. If they could not fight them, perhaps they could appease them, or at least understand their logic. He spent agonizing hours in deep, dangerous psychic trances, attempting to commune with the lesser demonic entities that now infested Xylos Prime. His hope was to find a pattern, a weakness, a way to manipulate their chaotic nature. What he found was not logic, but pure, unthinking hunger. The demons cared nothing for Kroot rituals or Kroot pleas. They were drawn by the raw psychic energy, by the suffering, by the despair, by the very act of their kindred's disintegration. They were predators, and the ghost eaters were their prey, their souls ripe for the taking. Kalar saw, in his tortured visions, the vast, cosmic indifference of the ruinous powers, their terrible agents simply following their inherent nature, drawn by the beacon the ghost eaters had become. The Shaper's dilemma was now absolute. There was no physical cure, no ritualistic purification, no means of simply reversing the terrible gift. The Velar essence had irrevocably altered the ghost eaters, tying them to the warp in a way no other Kroot kindred had ever been. They were a cancerous growth on the fabric of reality, a genetic aberration that would either consume itself or be consumed by the galaxy's hungry denizens. The only remaining question was how they would face their inevitable end, and what, if anything, could be salvaged from the burning wreck of their kindred. The relentless, chaotic psychic beacon of Xylos Prime now amplified by the Pyrrhic battle against the orcs and the heightened demonic activity, screamed across the void like a dying animal. It was a call that Inquisitor Lyra Vance, aboard the vigilant Scrutiny, could no longer ignore. Her reconnaissance drones had already painted a horrifying picture: a planet steeped in warp energy, a Kroot kindred steeped in demonic influence, and a situation rapidly spiraling out of control. The time for observation was over. The time for imperial vengeance had begun. The planetary assault was a chilling display of imperial might and ruthlessness. Vance, ever pragmatic, had assembled a force designed for maximum efficiency against a unique and unpredictable threat. Leading the ground insertion were seasoned companies of the Imperial Guard, specifically the Cadian 88th, veterans of countless Xenos purges and warp incursions. Their doctrine was unwavering: massed laser fire, disciplined advances, and an unshakable faith in the Emperor's protection. Supporting them were squads of Adeptus Mechanicus Scitarii, their augmetic senses providing unparalleled tactical data, and their galvanic rifles spitting arcs of lethal energy. More critically, Vance had brought with her a substantial retinue of Imperial sanctioned Psykers, battle-hardened individuals, many of whom were her own personal enforcers, their minds forged into weapons and their souls carefully shielded against the very forces the Kroot now wielded. The fleet of transports, gunships, and assault craft descended through the stormy atmosphere of Xylos Prime, their engines screaming defiance at the roiling, warp-tainted clouds. Even before landing, the Imperial Psykers began their counter-offense. A wave of focused psychic static was unleashed, a blunt instrument of mental interference designed to disrupt the Kroot's burgeoning abilities. It crashed into the Ghost Eater's collective consciousness like a physical hammer blow, overwhelming their already strained minds. For the gifted Kroot, it was agonizing, forcing many to their knees, clutching their heads as their chaotic inner world became even more deafening. For the cursed, it was disorienting, a strange, sickening pressure that made them question their own sanity. The Imperial Guard landed with practiced precision, establishing secure perimeters and deploying heavy weapon emplacements. Their initial objective was simple: containment and capture. Inquisitor Vance's orders were explicit: eliminate the demonic presence, secure the Vaelar cavern, and capture as many live Kroot as possible for study. She was particularly interested in Kalar, recognizing the Shaper as the likely nexus of the kindred's transformation. The Kroot, already weakened by their internal struggles and the constant demonic drain, found themselves caught between two impossible foes. The Imperials were not like the crude orcs. They were disciplined, technologically superior, and armed with their own psychic countermeasures. The Cadian 88th advanced in unwavering lines, their laser rifles barking, their heavy weapons tearing through the jungle canopy. Their voxcasters broadcast imperial litanies of hatred against the Xenos and the demon, a relentless assault on the Kroot's fragile morale. The Imperial-sanctioned Psykers proved to be a terrifying asset. Operating under the direct command of Vance's chief interrogator, a grim-faced man named Valerius, they projected powerful psychic wards that stifled the demonic incursions in their immediate vicinity, sending the creatures of the warp recoiling with agonizing screams. More dangerously, they unleashed their own focused psychic attacks on the Ghost Eaters. Streams of blinding force, bolts of pure mental energy, and waves of paralyzing terror tore through the Kroot ranks. A Kroot warrior, attempting to use his prescience to dodge an incoming last bolt, would find his mind suddenly bombarded with images of unimaginable agony, freezing him in place just long enough for the Imperial round to find its mark. Kalar, despite his immense personal suffering, rallied his remaining kindred. He knew this was a war they could not win through conventional means. Their numbers were dwindling, their psychic advantages nullified or turned against them. He saw his kindred fall, not to the crude savagery of orcs, but to the cold, clinical efficiency of the Imperium. He saw the gifted Kroot, their minds already broken, twitch and die under the combined psychic assault of the Imperial Psykers. He saw the Mechanicus Scitarii, their glowing eyes utterly devoid of emotion, systematically purifying areas with plasma and promethium, their heavy weapons tearing apart the ancient fern trees. His despair was profound, but it gave way to a chilling resolve. The Imperium did not seek to understand or to cure. They sought to dissect and eradicate. There would be no mercy, no quarter. Xylos Prime would become their tomb, and the Ghost Eaters a mere footnote in the annals of Xenos extermination. But Kalar also knew that the Imperium, for all its power, was a physical force. They were vulnerable to the very demonic energies the Ghost Eaters had inadvertently summoned. He recognized the Imperial-sanctioned Psykers as the linchpin of the assault, both their greatest weapon and their most vulnerable point. They were the shield against the demons, the sword against his kindred. If he could break their shield, if he could turn the very forces of the warp against the Imperium, then perhaps, just perhaps, his kindred could die on their own terms, or at least take a piece of the ravenous galaxy with them. Inquisitor Vance, observing the unfolding battle from the command bridge of her flagship, a grim satisfaction settling upon her features, saw the methodical destruction of the kindred. She noted the unique psychic resistance of some of the Kroot, their attempts at counterattack, their desperate, uncoordinated psychic flares. This was exactly what she had come for, to study the Xenos, to quantify the threat, to understand the mechanism of their warp taint before it could spread. Her triumph, however, was tinged with a flicker of unease. The demonic entities, though repelled by her Psykers, were not diminishing. They merely circled, like hungry vultures, waiting for a weakness to exploit. And she saw the Kroot shaper, Kalar, his movements imbued with a desperate, singular focus, clearly attempting to orchestrate something that sent a shiver of caution through even her hardened soul. The Imperial boot had landed, but the venom of Xylos Prime was still potent, and it might yet cost her dearly.